Hi Dan, hi Jack, hi Eileen, hi Robin, hi everybody, hi Mary Kay, hello Joan, hi Chris and Christy and Mike, hi everybody. Okay, so right, hello, this is Lynn. It's Philo Friday. It is Friday the 24th of April 2020, and my grandson's going to be 14 in 2 days. I think that's kind of cool. So it's getting towards that time of the year where I've got a lot of birthday presents to buy for people. Okay, so today is Philo Friday. Just to remind you what Philo is. Philo is a tradition of storytelling, usually between dinner and bedtime, where everybody gathered together and brought families together. It was a way of transmitting oral history, entertaining, staying warm, all those kinds of things. And since we're all separated from each other right now, quite radically through this lockdown, I've been doing these broadcasts every week to try to bring us a bit together, and also because right here it's Friday night here in England, and none of us are going out anywhere. We have to stay in, so there's nowhere to go. So that's why I had started these on Fridays. Normally I was doing it in the middle of the week, but I thought it would be kind of catchy to do them on Fridays. So anyways, today the podcast is all about nobility. Now, I know that some people said, no, I don't have any nobles in my family, but you'd be surprised. And I think once you hear a little bit more about it, you'd probably be interested to kind of take a look and see whether or not you do have nobility in your family. So I'm going to ask the first riddle. And while I'm asking the first riddle, I'd like you to put your answers down in the chat while I just run through a few reasons why I'm doing this in the first place, this particular podcast. So the question is, how did some people become nobility in Trentino specifically? How did some people become nobility? Put your guesses in the chat, and I'll come back to them after I read a little bit more here, or talk a little bit more about what I was going to talk about today. One of the reasons why I'm doing this topic is because people in general, I find, are really fascinated with the whole idea of nobility, probably because it's a bit exotic, it's foreign, it's not something we know about these days. It seems, something like fairy tales, and we imagine that it's very glamorous. It isn't necessarily all that glamorous, but we imagine it to be so, and so that's one of the reasons why people are really into it. It also gives a little color to our family trees. It makes us feel like there's something special about certain ancestors. And so not just people in the group, but clients of mine have always been very interested to find out more about their noble ancestors. Now, here's something. My experience is that just about, here I'm scrolling down here. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Hello, hello, hello. So Jack is saying notaries. Bernardo of Cles. Okay, I'll come back to those. Those are good guesses. As I was saying, just about everybody is going to find somebody noble in their family if you dig deeply enough in Trentino. I've found it almost invariably when I've done trees for other people. Almost invariably, you may think they're all farmers, but you're gonna find a noble here or there. And I think it's historically interesting. And also, the interesting thing about it as well is that there's actually a lot of information about nobility if you know where to look. And that makes it more interesting to do the research. So let's see. Some people are guessing. Reward for service to a lord. Dan Franceschi saying, yes, that's one thing. To reward for service to somebody in either nobility or even royalty, or also to prince bishops, and we'll be looking at that. Yes, and so Christy and Mike are saying Bernardo of Cles, who was one of the prince bishops. He's one of them as well, but he's not the only one. So prince bishops could give nobility. Jack is saying notaries. An awful lot of notaries ended up being nobles. And we're not talking about notaries today, but not all notaries were. But an awful lot of them ended up being noble because they were giving service. So let's see. Diana is saying, so hard to believe we all have some nobility. The question is, how did some, Francesco is asking, what was it? How did some people obtain nobility in Trentino? Diane, I guarantee you that if we look deeply enough, we'll find them in your tree. So anyway, so the answer is, So Chris is here by phone because she couldn't get her laptop to work. Okay, well, you're here. So the answer is there are three ways, but two of them are the most relevant to our research. One is there were families who were ancient nobles. They go way, way, way back, and we don't even know how to trace them. I have one of my lines, the Crozino line, for instance. They are connected to some family who were nobles back before anybody knew, where they came from. But the two key ones that we're going to be looking at are imperial nobility and ecclesiastical nobility. So Rita says she lost her sound. We'll chat later. Okay, sorry about that. We'll see you later. So imperial nobility, meaning something to do with the empire. So having to do with people who were either the emperor himself or the empress or people working under their chain of command. So that could be the counts and people like that. Those kinds of people, when they received nobility, when people received an award from them, those were called imperial nobility. There were also church nobility, which were given, wait a minute, when I'm saying the empire I'm talking about actually is the Holy Roman Empire. And you'll often see this written in Latin documents, or even Italian documents rather, as S.R.I, which stands for Sacro, Romano, Impero. So it's Holy Roman Empire. There goes my something. I think it's an earring. Lost an earring. Okay. So that you'll often see that next to names, S.R.I, meaning Sacro Romano Impero. So imperial in this case means Holy Roman Empire, which existed basically between 800 and 1800. There were also some after that who were part of the Austrian Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire, but primarily before that, the nobility really stopped once we get into the 19th century. So yes, emperors, empresses, counts, countesses, they could grant nobility, and that was all different kinds of imperial nobility. Now, ecclesiastical nobility, this is, you need a haircut first, so do I. Ecclesiastical nobility, as the word implies, it has to do with the church. Now, in Trentino, for a long period of time, for about 800 years, it was governed by a prince bishop. And I mentioned the prince bishops before. I wrote about them in my last article on the blog, which I'm getting ready to put another one on pretty soon. They were kind of a hybrid ruler. They were part priest, and well, they were priests, they were bishops, but they were also nobility, and actually kind of a minor royalty, because they were princes, weren't they? So they were a hybrid between church and empire. The advantages of that were plenty, because they they had loyalties to both. They kind of played both sides of the fence, and some of them were very, very powerful, and they did come from noble families themselves. So prince bishops could grant nobility, and a lot of my ancestors have ecclesiastical nobility. Now, the question was, why did they get it? Now, I think it was Dan up there was saying, in return for some service. Well, absolutely. They could be people who were, so as to men, right? So they could have been men who served on the right side of a winning battle, or something that was going on. For instance, what they call the rustic wars, the Guerra Rustica in 1525. If you were on the winning side, which was the Prince Bishop's side, and that was Bernardo Clay's, if you were on his side, you'd be favored. If you weren't, you'd kind of fall off the list. So yes, if you perform service, this is also why a lot of notaries did obtain nobility. Not all of them, but because they served in the government and in a lot of ways in terms of contracts and taking care of taxes and all these kinds of things. So yes, why did they get it? Usually in return for helping with the battle. In rural areas, there was a rising class of rural nobility. Now, a lot of us who have noble ancestors are going to fall into that category. few of us are going to have the high-ranking nobility, because that's just the way the numbers were. The higher-ranking nobles were no more than 10% of the strata of society. So therefore, the majority of people are down on the bottom of the pyramid. But there are some nobles that are falling into this category who come from the more simple classes. And so those are called rural nobility. Now, most of us who have noble ancestors are going to fall in that category. That's the truth. I have probably a good 10, 12 different lines of my own ancestry where they come from nobility. Some of them are through imperial lines, and a lot of them are also through ecclesiastical. So what's the advantage of being a noble? Well, it's posh. In many cases, you also were asked to collect rents. You had the privilege of collecting rents from people in the area and then giving that directly to the Prince Bishop or the Count, as the case may have been. So you basically took a cut of what was being collected. So there were advantages to it. You had favors, there was money, there was you were also granted, as a lot of people know in this group, you were granted a coat of arms. So, and I want to talk about those in a couple of minutes, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what a coat of arms is. So Francesco's saying during the Guerra Rustica, in the 16th century, it was in 1525 is when it took place, by the way. Castle near where he lives in Valagorina, the farmers were burnt alive. Oh no, they burnt alive the captain of the castle. Well, yeah, it was a very violent battle. Basically, the farmers were rebelling against the noble classes, but in the end, the farmers lost because they didn't have the firearms. Essentially, they didn't have the power, the strength. They were fighting with pitchforks and things like that. So the farmers in the end actually lost, even if they did burn the captain of the castle alive. But they were pretty angry. So there was an awful lot of that going on. It was in the Reformation era and post-Reformation era. So there was a lot of clash between the higher-ranking nobles and the peasants, the contadini. But cleverly, what happened is from this came the rise of rural nobility. And I think a lot of that was in an attempt to get them on the sweet side of being loyal, basically being loyal to whomever was issuing the nobility. So, okay, so here the second riddle is this: what kinds of things can we find out? Let's say we know that somebody's a noble ancestor, and I'm going to tell you about how, first of all, to find out that. What can we find out about noble ancestors, and how and where do we find that out? How do we find out if you have a noble ancestor or not? So again, put down your guesses in the chat, and while you're putting your guesses, I'm going to tell you how I'm going to break down the next part of the podcast. So I'm going to break it into how many did I write? Seven different areas. I'm going to talk about how you can tell if they're noble or not. How did it get passed down? How did nobility get passed down from generation to the next, one generation to the next? And if they were noble, how do you find out more about them, specific things about them? Who received the first title? How do you figure that out? How do you find out the family coat of arms? And where do the original documents exist? And lastly, when I say original, I mean the awards, where do those exist? And lastly, how do you record this information in your family tree? And that's something I do, and I'm going to walk you through some ideas about that. So I see Chris is asking church records. Louise is saying Austrian Registry of Nobility. You're both right, but in different circumstances. What other guesses? Any other guesses? So you're guessing where can you find this? Okay, so Chris is saying church records. Well, in some cases, yes. So the question one is, how do you tell if your ancestors are noble or not? Where do you find this out? Sometimes in church records, you're going to see the word, it's really obvious, noble. It will say, so-and-so, son of the noble so-and-so, was born today. And, well, that's a pretty good giveaway that that person is noble, that the father is noble, and then therefore so are his children. So that's one thing. And so, yes, church records, you will see that. However, and Louise, I'll come back to yours in a minute about the Austrian Registry of Nobility. I'm coming to that. You're right, but I'm coming to that in a minute. On different grave sites. No, I haven't. Well, actually, probably on graves, but that's going to be a lot harder to find information because graves generally don't last that long, as I've talked about in other in blog articles. They were recycled, and so the only old graves you're going to see are maybe really noble people, but a lot of priests as well, and those are tending to be inside the church, and they're usually the higher ups of the nobles, not the kind of ordinary nobles. So you probably won't find them on graves so much because they're going to have been recycled around. Military recognition, yes, that's one reason why they might receive it. So that's Diane is asking. That is definitely one reason, but not just, but some kind of service to the empire. How is noble noted in Latin and Italian records? So there are a couple of different ways, Robin's asking. You will see the word noble, or NOB, which is in both Italian and Latin, NOB. But there are two Latin words as well. This is what I was going to say, and I have to actually look up the spelling of the second one. If you see words that sometimes they kind of just look like a real scribble before the name, that looks something like illustrious or perilustrious, like that, P with lots of L's or I with lots of L's. Those are indicators that they're talking about a high-ranking noble. So when you see that, yes, NOB is one thing you will see, but you'll also see this abbreviation if it looks like illustrious or perilustrious. I can't remember the actual Latin. I have to look it up, but it's similar to that. If you see signore, you know, that's today they may use that just to mean Mr., but it's not. In the past, generally, it meant a gentleman. One other thing that's really interesting is that sometimes, but not always, sometimes when you see no surname at all, it can sometimes be an indication of nobility. I'll give you an example. I have one of my family lines are from the Campo family, who are really old nobles. They go back really far to, year 1000 or so. And actually they go before that, but with that name, they go back about that far. By the time I've traced them in the parish records, which of course don't go past the middle of the 1500s, you might see them appearing sometimes as, say, I'll give you an example, Marco of Gallio. It just says Marco, or the illustrious Marco of Gallio, or something like that. Or it might just say Marco of Gallio, or Federico of Gallio. Now, there's no surname there. And the reason being, in this particular case, is that this family was so known and so noble, they didn't have to say their surname. And also, the second reason is that Gallio, if you've ever been there, it's just this little, it's basically just a house on top of a hill. Now there's a few houses on top of the hill, but back then, they were the only people in Gallio. They were the nobles living on top of the hill. And so they didn't have to say that. I've also seen this with a lot of counts. They'll say, so-and-so, Count of Arco, but they don't say a surname necessarily. So it's sometimes, but not always, occasionally, absence of a surname might indicate that this person is so known that they don't need a surname. Now, Francesco's saying, egregio. No, egregio is actually something different. EGR or egregio, the word egregio, is actually a honorific reserved for notaries. I've never seen it used for anyone else except a notary or a judge who was also a notary. It's very specific. And also spectabilis. Those two. Actually, I may be thinking more. Spectabilis is the one for notaries. Egregio is usually a notary. But it can be for nobility as well. So the point is, though, it's hard sometimes to pick it up in records, and you have to compare and look for every little thing that comes before the names, because you might see noble appearing once in one of the children's records. Usually they're going to put it in all of them if that person is ennobled in that period of time. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just don't do it. Now, that can mean one of two things. Either the person wasn't ennobled before a certain date, or the priest just forgot to put it down, or just didn't bother to put it down. So here's, thanks for coming down the hill to speak. Down the hill. Actually, somebody in our group lives in Gallio, Gabriella Bleggi, so that's how I got to see Gallio. I went to visit her, and it's a very cool little village. It's not even a village, it's just a little clump of houses, actually. So the second question is this: how is nobility passed down? Now, let's understand, it doesn't exist anymore today, so this is theoretically. How did it get passed down in the past? One thing I want to make clear is, just because you might know that a certain surname is noble does not necessarily mean that you are descended from a noble line. And here's the reason why. Nobility is passed down from, let's say some man, so Giovanni, somebody, was given a noble title at some point. Let's just pick a year, say the year 1600. Well, okay, so the way it goes is that all of his descendants will inherit that noble title. His brothers may not. Sometimes whoever is granting it will give it to the brothers too, but maybe only he gets it. So it's only him and his descendants. It depends on the terms of the diploma. And as Louise is saying there, through male descendants, absolutely. It gets passed down. Actually, females can inherit a noble title. A female can inherit it, but only through another man. So let's say one of my noble lines is my grandmother's line, is the Onorati line, okay? So there were many different noble Onorati lines. And I've got about 10 of them in my tree, but they're all coming from different branches here and there. Now, if my surname were Onorati and my father's surname were Onorati, and he was descended directly from the person who was ennobled, Onorati, then I technically, although there's no such thing as nobility anymore, then I technically would still be entitled to say, oh, no, I'm noble, or I'm from that line. However, I'm not. My grandmother, even if she were directly descended from one of the noble lines, which she is, and she's kind of indirectly descended from it, even if she were directly descended from a man who still had the title, she couldn't pass it on to me. She couldn't pass it on to my father, and he then couldn't pass it on to me. So this is how surnames can lose their nobility. So if they didn't come from this person here, and these brothers over here didn't get it, then their children won't have it. And even if they intermarry at some point, sometimes the wife will be noble and the husband won't be. The wife can inherit the title, but she cannot pass it on. Those were just the rules. Those were just the rules. And I saw this with, I think it was Derek Kasari's tree, I think with his zini tree, if I'm not mistaken, where he had two people with both with zini name. One were noble, one wasn't. And the female was the one who was noble and the male didn't. So thereafter, the children, even though they had the same surname, they weren't called noble anymore because it wasn't inherited through the female. So let's see. But as a genealogist, I don't care. I know those are the rules of it. I don't care. I'm a female anyway. I love the fact that I see all of these things coming into my tree. I love the fact. Wouldn't your father have to have been the eldest male to inherit? No. No. The way nobility runs is, hi Steve, no, the way nobility is that if Giovanni here is given a title and it says to all of his heirs, it goes down through all the males. And the females will inherit it, but they cannot then pass it on because it's not heirs in that way. They're not heirs to the clan, because when a woman marries, she becomes part of a different clan. That's the thinking. All right, so she usually moves to another place. She even though women will retain their surname, often they're part of another clan. at that point, once they marry and have children there, because their children are then part of the other clan, the clan that she's married into. So no, they don't have to be the oldest child. They do have to be the eldest male to maybe inherit property, but not titles. Titles will go through the heirs. So now, if we found an ancestor and says this person is noble, how do we find out more about them? In other words, how do we find out where he got the title? Where do we go back? Now, I've got a few books I'm going to show you. One of them is probably the least useful, but it's really pretty, and I think a lot of people like it. This one, Heraldica Trentina, it's very, very heavy, and it's expensive. It's really expensive. I almost didn't buy. I think I paid about $70 or something for it. Ridiculous. It's very pretty, beautiful, beautiful pictures. It's not, as books go, sorry, I'm probably covering my mic. As books go, it's not the most useful. It is not the most, it's very pretty, lovely to have on a shelf, and I do consult it occasionally, but it is not the most useful of books on nobility. The one that I think only English use progenitor. No, no, Diane. In terms of inheritance, it is progenitor, but it's not the nobility in terms of that will come down as a rule. It depends on how the original thing was written. If it says so and so and all of his heirs in perpetuity, then it means all. The next book I wanted to show you is this one, and this is a fabulous book. And I'll put these titles, when I post this to YouTube, I'll put the titles of the book with the authors as well. This is by Tabarelli de Fatis and other authors. Now, this book, while it's not as pretty looking as the other one, it has incredible information about how the different titles were awarded, because families don't just get one. Usually if they get one, they might get another a few generations later, and maybe 100 years later from somebody else, and they'll get multiple titles as they go through history. And so this book tells who they are, who was awarded, and whether 3 brothers got awarded or only one or this or that. And so you can trace back. If you know back far enough, you can often trace back and find out who was the initial recipient of that award. And the other thing it has is in the back, it's got quite a few, not all, but quite a few stemmi. Now, stemmi are the coats of arms. Stemma is singular, stemmi is plural. And I want to talk about what those are in a minute. Now, these are not all of them, because there's no way you can have all of them. It would take volumes and volumes and volumes to have all of the stemmi. So, yeah, Dan was watching, Paula. He was watching before, so I know he's here. I'll talk about the stemmi in a minute. There's another book called, I don't have it in a print. I have it only in a PDF, and I'm trying to get I actually don't even have a PDF. I took photos of pages of it when I was in Trento a long time ago. I haven't bought it in hard copy only because it's really expensive, but it's called in translation, The Noble Families of Trentino by Adriano Camiani Guelfi. And it's not quite as comprehensive as this one. Now, the thing that is good about it is it has a whole list of all the rural nobles from 1529, and it also has a list of all of the available diplomas, and this I'm coming back to Louise's comments before, that are available in Innsbruck. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because this is where we're going to go talking about where do you find this stuff. So actually, where do you find this stuff? This is, I think, the best book on it. It's very concise. It's the best, most comprehensive book. There are several other books. There's an old dictionary of noble families that covers all of Italy, but with a heavy focus on Florence, that was written in 1886. Now, it has hardly any people from Trentino there, but it does have a few. It has, say, the Crosina family there, and it doesn't give it really much information. But it's an interesting book, and you can find it actually on Google Books. And again, I'll put that title up when I post this on YouTube. I'll have the names of the books on the title. I don't want you to think that only those kinds of things are where you can find information. You can also find monographs of specific families. Now, here's one I bought in Trento, which is very interesting. This is the Maffei family. Now, I don't have Maffei in my family tree, and this is a very thin book, but it's a really interesting little monograph, meaning it talks about the family, gives the history of the family. You can learn a lot from different monographs, and there are so many of them of different families. There's a book called the Castelli di Tirolo, I think, the Castles of Tyrol. Those talk about some of the higher noble families, and it even has family trees in the back. There's a family tree of the Campo family. It's a little hard to read and figure out, but those kinds of things are there. Books, any kind of book of local history of where your ancestors came from, look at any of them. If you come from Castelfondo, pick up a book on Castelfondo. If you come from Rivaux, pick up a book on Rivaux. If you come from Santa Croce, pick up a book on Santa Croce. They all talk about who the noble families in the area are. They don't maybe give as many details about specifics, but you will find out some information there. So pretty much any book from your ancestors' parish is going to talk about the noble families in there. So now, in terms of who received the first title, this is the book that I think is the best, because it does say it was granted here, and then it was granted here again, and by this person, and it gives the details of that. So let's get to the idea of Trentino nel Mondo office in Trento has a great collection of genealogy books. I'm sure they do. I multitask very well. Thank you, Chris. I don't know what you mean by that. Neues Jahrbuch in German can be found in Google Books. That's absolutely true. Can I speak about prefixes that are added to surnames and what they designate? That's very broad, and I think I'm going to have to do that in another call, Loretta. It's a very important topic. I tend to call them honorifics, and they all mean different things. So that's a topic I cover when I do translations for people. I put them in the notes, so I'll cover that on another call. So stemmi, in other words, coats of arms. Stemma is a coat of arms, a shield. And stemmi is the plural. Something people misunderstand is that a stemma is awarded to an individual. In other words, when somebody gets their nobility, they are granted the right of using a coat of arms. Sometimes they're given that right to use a coat of arms before they get nobility. I've seen that happen. And when families go down through the ages, they tend to adopt the coat of arms over time. One of the sons or grandsons might do something different to it, and I'm not quite sure how much permission they have to have of this, but things will evolve. For example, again, going back to the Crosina family, the Crosina family that I had mentioned, they originally came from Padova, and they came to Trentino, to Val Giudicari, in the 1200s. Now, when they moved to Padova, because Crosina has to do with the cross, okay? Their coat of arms is basically just a red cross on I think it was coming out of a tree stump. And it's still, still exists, that coat of arms. But over time, with different generations and different intermarriages, it's been segmented, it's had more things put in it, there have been crests all over it, and you will find tons and tons and tons of variations on this one stemma. Again, the Tabarelli book, Tabarelli de Fatis book, has a lot of those, but it doesn't have every single generation. It'll usually just have one or two of a specific family. So here's the thing. Is a family crest the same as a stemma? In this case, yes. But the thing is, this is what I'm saying, Jack. There isn't, I think that, I hate to say it, I think 99% of the stuff that you find on the internet that says it's so-and-so's family crest is just bunk. If they haven't been given through the right channels, then they're just made up. And I found that with the Irish too. A lot of Irish families are going to have family crests of this family and that family. I don't know anything about Irish nobility or about family crests, but I suspect that a lot of this is just made up, and I've seen a lot of it made up. So the way that when somebody has received a noble title, the crest, the hand-drawn crest, is actually part of the diploma. Diploma is the document that is given when they're granted the nobility, and it describes what the crest is, what the stemma is. So yes, Jack, you're right. It's about money, those places. Yes, it absolutely is. So So the question is, where do the original documents exist? In other words, where can we see what it says? Of course, we'd have to understand Latin because they're all written in Latin. Where can we see what it says about who granted the title, why it was granted? Although that's usually pretty bog standard answers. They kind of say, you know, for illustrious service, blah, blah, blah. But sometimes they go into more detail. Who granted the title? What date it was given? What were the terms of it? Like were there other brothers involved or other people who were granted it at the same time? And what was the stemma that was defined at the time of granting the title? Those documents, not all of them, but an awful lot of them exist. Now, where do they exist? Now, I'm coming back to what Louise was saying. She was saying up in Innsbruck, yes, if a person was an imperial noble, in other words, that if they were granted their title through some part of the empire, so not the prince bishop, some part of the empire, those documents, a lot of them, hundreds of them, still exist in Innsbruck. They're kept in the state archives in Innsbruck. I keep wanting to go up there to do a nobility tour and see what I can do. I don't actually know what their rules are around accessing and photographing the documents or that kind of stuff, so I haven't actually inquired yet. But I know they exist because, well, for one, Louise got me a copy of one of the diplomas from Emperor Maximiliano II, who granted it in 1573, is it? 1573 to Sebastiano Giannetti, who is my ancestor, who came from Castelfondo. And it's brilliant because it's a photocopy, it's a PDF. You know, I would love to see the original and look at the color. And it was handwritten, all the reasons why they were granting this to him. And it has a picture of the stemma, the original stemma, which of course has changed over time. And at the end, here's the coolest bit. It has the emperor's signature. It almost looks like a mirror signature. It's so bizarre. And I find it really, really cool to look at this original thing and realize that this was handed to my ancestor and was in that family. So those kinds of things, anything that came from one of the emperors or the counts or the countesses or anything to do with the Holy Roman Empire / Austria at that point later, those are housed in Innsbruck. Now, if one of your ancestors was ennobled by one of the prince bishops, this is what I've been told, although I haven't actually seen them, I was told in Trento, those are housed at the Archivio di Stato in Trento. And I remember going there once to try to find the diploma for one of my Onorati ancestors, and he looked at when it was issued, and he said, oh no, this was issued by the empress, one of the empresses, I think, or duchesses, I can't remember who, but it was some imperial diploma. He said, no, those are in Innsbruck, they're not here. We don't own those because those are government and those belong to Austria. Anything to do with the church, in other words, the prince bishops, those are still part of Trento because the bishop is the bishop and is still part of the church. So that's where they are. Louise is saying you can write to the registry and they will respond to you. She's had an extensive email with them. Can I please spell stemma? Chris, you have it right, but it's got two M's. S-T-E-M-M-A, stemma, 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 or stemmi. So, da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da. Right, okay. So the thing that I wanted to then mention is, how do you record this in your tree? How do you record somebody? So if you find somebody who's noble, or if you see some mention that somebody is noble in your tree, but you have no proof necessarily, or even if you do have proof, this is what I do. I use a program called Family Tree Maker, but I believe you can also do this on Ancestry, and I'm sure you can do this with other programs as well. I create a custom fact called nobility. And when I do that, I make it so that I can put in a date, a place, and a description. And so I put in, let's say all I did so far is find the word noble next to somebody's name in a baptismal record of one of his children. So I'll say, so Giovanni is nobility sometime before 1660. That's what I'll write, because the child was born in 1660. So say he was nobility by 1660 or before 1660, because that's as far back as my proof is so far. And then I'll write where it is, and then in the description I'll say, where did I see that? And I'll say, cited as noble in the baptismal record of his daughter Maria on May 1st, 1660, or whatever it is. So I write all of that down. And then what I also do is I create a source citation. This is a little more technical and complicated, but I create a source citation for the baptismal record of that child, and I link it to the fact called nobility. Now, that's a little more detailed, and it's too hard to explain in a podcast, and it's boring. But that's how I record it. That way, if I'm comparing documents and I see someone else, and I had to do this when I was translating for, who was I translating for? Nick Stadil in this group. There was a conundrum because there were too many Domenico Onoratis, and I couldn't figure out which one was which. And there was a Caterina, daughter of Domenico, and there were three. And I had to figure out which one belonged to whom. And I had to go and read every little bit of detail, and it all centered around nobility and the fact that one of them was called senior and the other was called junior, or the younger. It was difficult to even notice that if you read too quickly. I had to scour through every single record, and a lot of it had to do with looking at what was the language involved, who had the more exalted titles. Was she this person's daughter or that person's daughter? And in the end, I found out she was this person's daughter, not that person's daughter. And it all had to do with figuring out what the nobility was. Now, if I hadn't put all the breadcrumbs down to find my way back to where I found those records, I would have gotten lost, and my tree, or Nick's tree in this case, would have been an absolute mess. So I hope it isn't a mess. I hope I've done it right. But that's what I would do. Yes, Betty just saying it confuses me. Yes, it can be confusing. You have to. The key thing about recording any of these things is to write copious amounts of notes. If you're not into computer programs, then just write lots of notes. Write down anytime you've noticed something. And if a record says that a man is a noble in 1660, then it stands to reason he was either born noble or he achieved that title sometime before that date. So that's why you want to keep recording it. And then as you go back and back and back, you can piece it all together. The more you deepen your research, you can figure it all out. Anyway, gosh, I've gone almost 45 minutes. I didn't expect, it sounds like my mess. Yes, Giselle. Mine too. I went further than I thought. I didn't think I would have that much to talk about this. I hope you found it a little bit interesting. When I put this on YouTube, I'll put the names of the books and covers of the books in the video so you can come back to it. And in the meantime, happy researching, and I'll see you next Friday. Ciao, ciao.